مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. ماذا يريد الأمريكيون حقا؟ ما الذي يهمهم حقا؟ هل شخص لديه أشياء يفعلها ولكنها ليست متساوية في الأهمية؟ مثلا بعض الناس يحبون البروكلي وبعض الآخر يحبون المثلجات، ولكن ثمة قلة من الناس قد يصنفون البروكلي أو المثلجات على أنها من بين أهم الأشياء في حياتهم. في الوقت الذي يركز فيه الأمريكيون على الأساسيات مثل صحتهم، منازلهم، وظائفهم وأطفالهم، من المنطقي أن يلقي الخبراء السياسيون نظرة عن كثب على ما يقوله الناس أو ما يريدونه من الحكومة وما هي بالفعل أولوياتهم. هذا تمرين مهم بشكل خاص في وقت امتلاء فيه نقاشنا العام بالقضية، بدءا من الإجهاد والسيطرة على السلاح إلى تغير المناخ والإصلاح الضريبي. هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن سنبتعد عن العناوين الرئيسية لنلقي نظرة أوسع على طريقة تحديد الأمريكيين للأولويات المتعلقة بحياتهم ومطالبهم من الحكومة. ضيفتنا هما خبيرة الرأي العام كارلين بومان وصحفية ميني روكر. Welcome back to داخل Washington. Polls, public opinion. Americans are polled just about more than anyone else in the world. We're polled about what we do when we wake up in the morning, what we do when we go to bed, what we like to eat, what we do when we drive a car, let alone all of our political polls about who we like, who we don't like, who's rising, who's falling. Do our opinions really matter so much? Does everyone's opinion count? Should they? Let's talk today about what really matters, what polls we should focus on, and what we shouldn't. I'm delighted to welcome today two really important experts on public opinion, on polling, and what people of various generations really think and really want. I'm delighted to welcome Carlin Bowman and Minnie Rocker. Thank you for joining us today. So Carlin, let me start for you. Does everyone's opinion really matter on everything?
Polls are a very useful tool to understand a complex public. I don't think they should ever be used to make policy. But that said, I think it's extremely important for politicians to be aware of what the broad swath of Americans are thinking across a wide variety of issues. I think it's very, very important.
What do people really care about, Minnie? When you ask, in your experience, talking to people, let's say even of your generation, what do people really care about?
I would say people care about and have always cared about the kinds of bread and butter issues that you see politicians prioritizing. So that's infrastructure, that's affordable health care. Right now, that's of course the pandemic, which has shot up in importance in the past month or so. But then you also see like folks care a little bit about, what politicians are doing to show that they're kind of on their team. We see this kind of increasing partisan polarization. So Democrats are really on Team Democrat and Republicans are really on Team Republican, and they want to see their politicians leaning into those identities because that's a reflection of their own identities too.
And Carlin, when you look at public opinion polling over time, are there the same general priorities that most Americans list among the top 3 or 4 items that they care most about?
Well, I think Mimi's correct that financial, economic issues, how's my family doing, those issues tend to be very important. But in terms of my take on public opinion, I think Americans rarely start with policy proposals when they're thinking about things that are important to them. They think about values. Whereas those of us in the elite world of Washington, we tend to think about the accumulation of factual information on X, Y, or Z, whereas publics rarely are that attentive. So therefore, they start with their values. And I think it's a very sophisticated way of knowing in many ways. It's not the royal road to judgment, but it certainly is important overall.
So I want to ask a few questions about this because I find the whole issue quite fascinating. Do people's values, do the priorities they put on what is important to them, does it change over time with an individual? Does the same person in their 20s have the same set of personal priorities in their 40s and their 60s? Let me ask you, Carlin, then I'll get your view on this, Minnie.
We look at two different things in the polling world. We look at life cycle effects, those things that happen to you when you're coming of age. It was either Disraeli or Churchill who said, if you're not a socialist at 20, you don't have a heart. If you're not a conservative in 40, you don't have a head. But that said, coming of age values can be very different from values that you have when you are more secure in your community, when you have a family, when you have a job that's secure. And so things do change over time. If you look at my generation, the 60s generation, we were pretty democratic in the late 1960s. By the mid 80s, we were still pretty democratic. But if you ask people about their ideology, in the 60s, in the late 60s, my generation said that they were pretty liberal, but that changed pretty dramatically by 20 years later when they began to say they were conservatives. And one of the major pollsters asked, well, why have you changed? And the answer was family responsibility. So again, you see the difference between life cycle effects and things that change over the course of time.
And so let me ask you, Minnie, when young people think about their priorities, do they see themselves, and how do they view their parents' views in light of what they want?
I would largely agree that there is a real impact of age on your priorities. So over the past year or so, for instance, we've seen young people tend to have these more kind of activist views than their parents on issues like racial justice and policing that have been kind of top of mind for Americans for more than a year now. And then also, yeah, there's some real life circumstance issues that come up. For instance, student loans are a big priority for many people around my age, many people who are kind of still in that phase of life before they're thinking about security for their family. They're thinking about, okay, well, how do I tackle this issue that's in front of me as a person who's in their, 20s or 30s?
And when you think about all the other uh, 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 variables that one can look at, whether it's put aside age, but gender, race, religion, ethnicity, income, education. Is there one of these that stands out that is an indicator more than any other of where someone is going to be on values, conservative, liberal, or politics, Democrat, Republican? What do you think, Minnie?
I think just from the list that you just gave, the thing I think about is gender, which was in the last election, a big predictor of whether you were supporting Republicans or Democrats. So women tend to lean more Democratic. And then also thinking about abortion, which has been in the news since the recent Texas abortion law. We see a pretty a bigger opposition to it from women who tend to have more personal experience or more kind of personal relation to that issue. So while Americans in general, a majority of them are kind of opposed to this Texas abortion law, we see that more strongly with women than with men.
So, Minnie suggests that gender is a key issue. Does the data bear that out, Carlin?
I think I have a slightly different perspective. The gender gap, the differences between men and women, has been with us since the 1980 election. Many people thought it would be larger in 2020. It was not, even though it's still a very large gap. The marriage gap in our politics is much larger overall, and you see that on many of the values issues overall. But speaking specifically about the very controversial Texas abortion law, one of the things that I looked at this morning was a new YouGov poll. They combined surveys from September of 2020 through today. And what you see is some very profound regional differences in America. States like Mississippi and Texas are very different from Massachusetts. So I think it's important to look at a lot of these different kinds of variables overall. Gender Obviously, women are 53% of the American population. They vote at higher rates than men. That's been true since 1980. So gender is important. But I think I look at a lot of other variables beside gender because I think many others are extremely important.
You mentioned in passing the marriage gap. Could you explain to our viewers what that is? I assume that's not differences between husbands and wives.
Well, sometimes it is, but the marriage gap is the difference between people who check a box on our exit polls that the exit pollsters hand out on election day that that asks you to check, are you married? And then there's another category. The other category is not married. Now, that not married category is a complicated category because it includes people who are single, never married, those people who are widowed, and those people who are divorced. So the single category, you've got to be very carefully about how you describe that other category. But married people are the vast share of the population still, even though the marriage rate in the United States has been going down for some time. But obviously, we always watch the views of young people, many of whom are single, as an indicator of which way the winds are blowing, particularly young people in college. Those tend to be the ones that give us some clues about the direction of things.
Okay, well, when we come back, we're going to focus on that for a moment, talk about some of the different generations out there. What is Gen Z all about? And how do they differ from, I'm afraid to say, my generation? I'm the last of the boomers. So
Me
when we
too.
come back in just a moment here on Dakhel, Washington. With Congress likely to consider a massive $3.5 trillion spending bill, let's take a moment to step back and look at federal spending over time. The first spending bill approved by our national legislature in accordance with the Constitution was way back in 1789, when the very first Congress approved the first appropriations bill for the whopping sum of $639,000, a sum which covered all federal government expenses for the year. In today's dollars, adjusted for inflation, that amounts to just $214 million, a rounding error in today's budget. Our first national budget to exceed $100 billion was in 1962. That doubled in just 8 years, and it finally hit $1 trillion in 1987. Speaking of a trillion, our national debt topped $1 trillion in 1981. We've had a debt every year since independence, except, interestingly, during the 1830s, when President Andrew Jackson briefly wiped it out. Our debt now is $28 trillion, or about $86,000 for every man, woman, and child in America, a number that grows by millions every day. And you thought balancing your checkbook was tough. Again, my guests today include Carlin Bowman. Carlin is a distinguished senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a prominent conservative think tank here in Washington. Also a weekly columnist for Forbes, she is an expert in American public opinion who has tracked popular views on everything from the economy to foreign policy to climate change. Also joining us is Minnie Rocker. Minnie is staff correspondent at National Journal, where she covers the intersection of politics and culture, as well as the progressive movement. She writes weekly long-form features on national politics, shorter profiles on personalities, hearings and trends on the Hill and around D.C. So, Minnie, let's begin with Gen Z. Who is that? What do they think? And what do they want?
So Gen Z is the folks who are born primarily after 1996 or so our youngest voters. I would say that they're leaning fairly far left, leaning fairly towards the Democrats. There are, of course, still plenty of Republicans in this generation, But we see these folks kind of be heavily in support of social issues on the left, like, for instance, same-sex marriage. We see a really high priority on climate change, since this is the generation that's probably going to be dealing with some of the worst of the effects that we've seen of that, is already dealing with it. We see a focus, as I said earlier, on policing, on crime, and kind of a new way of approaching a lot of these issues that kind of were too hot button for older generations, and maybe were not in the political discussion 10 years ago.
And Carlin, if the past is prologue, what percentage of Gen Zers will have similar views 20, 40 years from now?
It's very hard to know. I think I can't answer that question. There certainly will be some attrition over time, but in terms of the issues that Mimi spoke about, I think it's important to put them in a broader context. Yes, young people are always the most activist generation in our politics. Many of the Gen Z are not even old enough to vote yet at this particular point. But they are certainly more democratic. They are certainly more liberal. They are passive environmentalists, not active overall. They are certainly at the forefront, particularly those in college, in terms of social change, support for gay marriage, more interested in transsexual issues than other generations overall. But there are also some really interesting differences between this generation and their older brothers and sisters who lived through both the very serious recession and financial crash of 2007, 2008, and are now living through the pandemic. That generation is a little bit more pessimistic than the youngest generation. The youngest generation in our politics always tends, even with all of the problems we have, and they're certainly serious, but even with all the problems that they have, are the most optimistic about where they'll be. This is part of the life cycle effect that I described earlier. They're more optimistic than millennials, the next older generation overall. So that's an interesting pattern in the data too.
Interesting. All right, so let's go to the other end of the spectrum. I'm afraid to say that I'm approaching the other end of the spectrum. No one else on this show is, but I'm I'm at the end of the boomers. What do we? I mean, we're ridiculed by our kids and by Gen Z. Okay, boomer. So what do we want? It doesn't matter anymore. Carlin, let me begin with you.
I think it's appropriate for me because I am part of that generation. I think we want many of the same things that other Americans want.
Very interesting. Actually, let me ask you, Minnie, just about race in Gen Z, because I see this in my own kids. Their view of race is so totally different than what I grew up with. Not to say it's a non-issue, because it's a huge issue, but they see the world very differently than the way I saw it, with busing and segregation, desegregation, such an issue when I was that age. How do you describe race among people of Gen Z?
Oh, that is a big question. It's very complicated. I would say there's, as we see demographics changing with America on its way to being a majority minority nation, for a lot of folks, my age and younger, it's just kind of a different reality that they're used to. You see this real kind of fruition, I think, of the melting pot, where, for instance, in the census this year, we saw this huge increase in the number of people who identify as multiracial. And we see just a lot more complexity in terms of that issue, rather than being black and white. Over the past year, we've seen this huge conversation about police violence against Black people, which has been, of course, sparked by videos from mobile phones, which have kind of just become, a huge thing in the past 10 years or so. But we've also seen, for instance, rising groups of Asian American political activists addressing hate crimes against Asian Americans. And we've seen Asian Americans participating in electoral politics at rapidly rising rates.
Well, Carlin, Minnie, I'm afraid that we've run out of time. I want to thank you both very much for helping to explain what lies behind some of the polling that we read so much about. Thank you for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. If a Martian visited the United States, he or she or whatever would be perplexed at some of our public policy decisions. Let's start with gun control. A clear majority, sometimes more than 60%, always more than 50%, wants stricter gun control laws, whereas a clear minority, usually in the 30s, sometimes just in the 20s, says it opposes tighter laws. Why then has there been virtually no federal gun control legislation in 25 years? Or take abortion. Gallup asked Americans every year if they considered themselves pro-choice or pro-life. And for more than 20 years, a clear majority said pro-choice, a term that generally means they deferred to the decision of the woman, even with some state restrictions. Why then are state after state considering and even approving legislation that effectively bans a procedure that the Supreme Court ruled constitutional a half-century ago? In other words, why does our public policy often not reflect the views and mood of our nation? It is a question that many around the world ask about the United States. To be frank, it's a question many Americans ask about our country too. There are many aspects to the answer, some satisfying, others less so. Here are a few. Just because you have a view doesn't mean it matters. We poll everything these days, which forces people to have views on everything. But just because you have a view on something, so what? Polls tell you preferences, but preferences don't make policy. Just because you like something or don't like something doesn't mean you're willing to take action about it. I don't like broccoli, but I'm not going to lobby my congressman to ban it or to tax it. And I'm certainly not going to join a violent underground organization committed to blowing up broccoli farms. Depth of commitment matters at least as much, perhaps more, than breadth of commitment. 20% of people who really care about something will almost always be a more potent political force than 40% of people who have a preference but no strong commitment. This is why a minority can stymie gun control legislation and make progress toward banning abortion. For these advocates, these are the most important issues in the world. For most of the rest of us, they're two key issues among many, many competing with priorities with other issues, from climate change to war and peace. Also, in our two-party system, where party discipline is weak and election costs are high, our senators and representatives have views on everything, but respond to the committed few most of all. They're the ones that vote, they donate, they march, they scream, they shout. In other words, they matter. Add it all up, and you get a system that appears warped on the outside, but actually has its own impeccable internal logic. Should it be fixed? Perhaps. But the best way to do that is for the passive majority to stop being so passive. When all is said and done, a truly motivated majority cannot lose. That's an iron law of politics here on Earth and on Mars too. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة فيما يتعلق بأولويات السياسة الخارجية القصوى لمعظم الناخبين الأمريكيين، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.